Washington's second largest city is still on fire. Was on fire, not caught fire once and moved on. Spokane has been burning, evacuating, and rebuilding its own understanding of what wildfire means to an American city for more than a week now. And as of the last update coming out of Spokane County, the danger has not fully passed. Nearly 1,000 structures have been damaged or destroyed. Tens of thousands of people were forced out of their homes in a single Saturday afternoon. The National Guard was activated for the first time for a wildfire in this state since 2021. And just this week, fire officials warned that critical fire weather is returning to the region, threatening to undo some of the hard-won progress crews have made on the containment lines. This is the story of how a city of 230,000 people, sitting well inside what most Americans think of as normal suburban terrain, ended up watching entire neighborhoods burn down to their foundations. It's a story about a spark at a roadside intersection, about a man who allegedly told police he had been planning something like this for months, about physics and wind speed and humidity readings that turned an ordinary patch of dry grass into something closer to an explosion. And it's a story about what happens after the flames move on, when thousands of families come home to nothing but a chimney and a slab of scorched concrete where their house used to stand. Let's start with how it actually began, because the sequence matters. On the morning of Saturday, August 1st, the forecast for Spokane called for temperatures pushing into the high 90s, relative humidity sitting in the single digits, and wind gusts expected to climb to 35, even 45 miles an hour by the afternoon. Anyone who studies fire behavior for a living would have looked at that combination and understood immediately what it meant. Vegetation across the region had already been drying out for months, first through a dry spring, then through a summer heat wave that pushed well above normal temperatures across the western United States. By the start of August, the grass and brush around Spokane's northwestern edge were sitting at what fire analysts call critical fuel moisture, dry enough that almost nothing was needed to set them off. All that was missing was an ignition source. That ignition source appeared at roughly midday, at the intersection of North Old Trails Road and West Euclid Road in the northwest part of the city near Airway Heights. A passerby named Paul Child later told investigators he noticed a man kneeling near the grass at the roadside, acting nervous. Child kept walking. When he doubled back a short while later and saw smoke rising from that same spot, he called the Spokane County Sheriff's Office. Within 20 minutes, what had started as an estimated 50 acres had already doubled to 100. State firefighters were mobilized by early afternoon, but the fire was already outrunning them. It tore through Riverside State Park, burning through open brush country where there was essentially nothing to slow it. Then it did something that should not have been possible for a fire without a much longer runway. It jumped straight across the Spokane River. A natural fire break that should have stopped, or at least slowed the advance, did nothing. The fire crossed the water, climbed uphill on the far side, cut through an old landfill, and pushed directly into the Indian Trail neighborhood, one of the most densely populated residential areas on that side of the city. This fire, now known as the Old Trails Fire, was not the only one that day. A second fire, later named the Fairview Fire, broke out on the other side of the county that same afternoon, in the Meade and Peony Prairie area to the northeast. A third fire, the Autumn Lane Fire, ignited shortly before 4 in the afternoon, northwest of the first blaze, and would go on to become the largest of the three, eventually burning through the Indian Trail area northeast of Airway Heights. Within a matter of hours, Spokane County had 3 major fires burning simultaneously in different parts of the same county on the same Saturday afternoon. Officials would later combine all 3 into a single managed incident, sometimes called the Spokane Complex Fire, and sometimes referred to simply as the Spokane Area Fires, a name you'll hear used interchangeably in most of the official updates. To understand why this spread as violently as it did, it helps to understand a little bit about how fire behavior actually works, because none of what happened on August 1st was random or unpredictable. Fuel moisture is the single most important variable in how a wildfire behaves. Green, living vegetation can hold fuel moisture content well above 100%, and fire moving through that kind of vegetation spreads slowly and can usually be stopped with a fire line of modest width. As vegetation dries out, that number drops, and fire behavior changes with it. Once fuel moisture falls to around 30%, fire behavior becomes active. At 15%, it becomes aggressive. Somewhere between 8 and 10%, fire behavior crosses into what analysts describe as extreme. Below 8%, it's described as critical. By every indication, the grass and brush around northwest Spokane on August 1st were sitting in that critical range, a direct result of the drought conditions and heat wave that had been building across the region all summer. Now add wind to that equation, because wind doesn't just push flames sideways, it changes the entire physics of how a fire spreads. Fire spread rate scales with wind speed in a way that isn't linear. Doubling the wind speed doesn't just double how fast a fire moves, it multiplies the spread rate by significantly more than that, because wind does 2 things simultaneously. It feeds the fire more oxygen, and it tilts the flames forward, preheating the fuel that's still ahead of the fire before the flames even reach it, cutting down the time it takes for that fuel to ignite. At the wind speeds recorded in Spokane that Saturday, 35 to 45 miles an hour, fire in critical fuel conditions doesn't spread in the way most people picture. It runs, and it doesn't just run along the ground. High winds loft burning embers well ahead of the main fire front, sometimes a quarter mile, sometimes half a mile or more, in a process fire crews call spotting. Every one of those embers that lands somewhere new and catches becomes its own ignition point, and each of those ignition points becomes its own fire front. Once spotting takes over, the fire's effective spread is no longer limited by how fast flames can move through continuous fuel. It's limited only by how far the wind can carry a burning ember and how quickly that ember can start something new. This is exactly why the evacuation language used that Saturday was so blunt. Level 3 evacuation orders, the highest level, meaning leave immediately, carry an entirely different sense of urgency in a fire that's actively spotting, compared to one that's slowly creeping through underbrush. In spotting conditions, a house 3 blocks away from the visible fire front can have burning embers landing on its roof while the main fire is still a quarter mile off. On dry wood shingles, dry decking, and dry landscaping right up against a house, the time between an ember landing and a structure catching fire can be measured in minutes, not hours. That's why officials weren't being dramatic when they told residents this may be your only notice. Once the fire encloses you, you may not be able to get out. It wasn't caution for caution's sake. It was a direct response to how fast this specific fire, under these specific conditions, was capable of moving. By late Saturday afternoon, the scale of what was unfolding had pushed well past anything local resources could handle on their own. The governor was being briefed that Spokane was moving into a full-blown crisis. Mass evacuation orders went out covering a huge swath of the city, everything north of Francis Avenue and west of Division Street, forcing residents out with almost no warning at all. Video that circulated afterward showed people driving through their own neighborhoods, filming out the car window in something close to disbelief at what they were watching happened to streets they'd lived on for years. Officials say roughly 60,000 people were forced to evacuate within the city limits alone, with figures climbing toward 65,000 once the surrounding county areas were factored in. At its peak, the fire was threatening as many as 5,000 structures across the region. Homes, businesses, and community buildings together, roughly 40,000 customers of the local utility, Avista, lost power at the height of the crisis. The company later confirmed that the fire had burned directly through parts of its infrastructure, rather than any equipment failure being the cause of the blaze itself. The Man Grandstaff VA Medical Center had to evacuate patients under emergency conditions, moving already vulnerable people out of harm's way with very little advance notice. More than 400 families spent that first night sleeping at the Spokane Convention Center, which the city opened as an emergency shelter. Cots lined up in a space normally used for trade shows and conferences. A separate shelter opened in Spokane Valley specifically to take in displaced pets, and across local community groups online, post after post showed people scrambling to find trailers on short notice so they could get horses and livestock out of the danger zone before it was too late. Spokane's Mayor Lisa Brown declared a local state of emergency, and the governor, Bob Ferguson, followed by activating the Washington National Guard. The first time the Guard had been called up in the state for a wildfire since 2021. A genuinely significant escalation that tells you how far beyond ordinary firefighting capacity this event had already pushed things. About 9 hours into the crisis, officials still didn't have a clear picture of exactly how large the fire had grown because its growth was simply outpacing their ability to map it in real time. By Sunday morning, more than 600 structures were confirmed burned, with officials warning the number would almost certainly keep climbing as damage assessment teams worked block by block through the wreckage. Entire blocks in the Indian Trail neighborhood and out on the 5-mile prairie had burned straight down to their foundations, leaving nothing standing but chimneys and scorched concrete slabs where homes used to be. At that point, combined, the 3 fires had burned well past 7,000 acres, something in the neighborhood of 11 square miles. And containment across all 3 sat at 0%. 0% containment means fire crews haven't yet been able to establish a single secure line around any part of the fire's perimeter. Large air tankers, including specialized water scooping planes commonly called super scoopers, worked the fire lines around the clock. More than 4,000 firefighters were eventually pulled in from a dozen different states, plus additional crews from Australia, to help fight this in Eastern Washington. A mobilization that says a great deal about how quickly local and state resources became overwhelmed by the scale of what they were facing. If you've been following coverage of this event online, you'll also have seen a very specific and very serious request coming directly from fire crews. Please do not fly personal drones anywhere near these fire zones. A single drone sighting is enough to ground every firefighting aircraft in the area until the airspace can be confirmed clear again, and that can set firefighting efforts back by hours at exactly the moment those hours matter most. The same warning applies out on the lakes in the region. If you're out on the water and you see a fire bomber plane coming in low to scoop water, get out of the way immediately, because those planes cannot safely draw water with boats sitting in that area, and every delayed water run means less retardant reaching the fire line when it's needed. There was one small piece of good news in the middle of all this. By Sunday, forward progress on the Fairview and Old Trails fires had mostly stalled because cooler temperatures, lighter winds, and even a bit of rain moved through parts of the region. That's genuinely the only encouraging development in the early part of this story. And even then, the fires were still actively burning regardless of the temporary break in the weather. It's worth pausing here to put this event in context, because Spokane County has been through something like this before, and that history matters for understanding just how quickly conditions here can turn catastrophic. Back in August of 2023, the county was hit by two separate major fires on the very same day. One of them, the Gray Fire, burned more than 10,000 acres near Medical Lake, destroyed roughly 240 homes, and killed one person before crews finally got it fully contained. A second fire that same day, generally known as the Oregon Road Fire, burned close to 11,000 acres, destroyed more than 300 structures, including over 100 primary residences, and claimed a second life. Spokane recorded the worst air quality anywhere in the United States for 2 consecutive days during that same 2023 event. Now, just 3 years later, this is happening again at an even larger scale, with more structures lost in this single event than in either of those 2023 fires individually. The response at the federal level has been significant. FEMA authorized federal emergency funds, and Washington's governor spoke directly with the White House about securing a federal emergency declaration for the state. Governor Ferguson also declared a statewide burn ban, prohibiting most outdoor and agricultural burning while these conditions persist. And that ban has since been extended through the end of September, reflecting official expectations that the conditions capable of producing fires like this one will continue for at least another 2 months. As of the most recent official reporting, remarkably, no deaths or serious injuries have been confirmed from any of the 3 fires, genuinely striking given the scale of destruction involved, though officials continue to caution that damage assessment is still very much ongoing, and the full picture may take more time to emerge as crews keep working through affected neighborhoods. If you're in a level 3 evacuation zone, officials have been direct about one thing. Do not go back to check on your property until you've been told it's actually safe to return. Several evacuees who went back early have described walking through rubble that was still radiating heat hours after the flames themselves had moved through and on. Washington's own state land management officials have also been blunt about the bigger picture here. This was already shaping up to be one of the busiest wildfire years on record for the state, and August had barely started when this hit. More than 1,000 separate fires have already burned across roughly 425,000 acres statewide this year, the most since 2021, and firefighting resources across the state were already stretched thin before this particular complex of fires even ignited. Officials are describing this as a likely turning point in how the state approaches wildfire prevention funding going forward, even as they point out that mitigation work already completed this year likely made things somewhat less severe than they otherwise could have been. There's also a reason this particular disaster caught so many people off guard, despite officials insisting they saw real warning signs coming well in advance. The day before the first fire ignited, the National Weather Service issued its first ever particularly dangerous situation declaration specifically for eastern Washington. A warning level normally reserved for only the most extreme fire weather conditions imaginable, the kind of alert meteorologists don't issue lightly. Governor Ferguson had already declared a statewide state of emergency and a statewide burn ban that same Saturday morning, before a single one of the 3 fires had even started, essentially pre-positioning the state's emergency response infrastructure ahead of a threat that everyone in a position to see it could see building. Avista, the power company, had already warned the day before that it might need to preemptively shut off power in certain areas given the conditions. Everybody who understood fire weather saw this coming. Almost nobody could actually stop it once the winds picked up and the humidity dropped as low as it did. This same weather pattern wasn't confined to Spokane. Across the border in eastern British Columbia, in the Okanagan wine region around the town of Vernon, a massive fire merged with 2 others burning near Cache Creek in the town of Clinton. Homes right on the lakefront, the kind of properties people generally assume are naturally protected by the surrounding water. Burned anyway, which is always a shock, even though the region has seen fire jump across lakes there before. Down in Oregon, ranchers have largely been fighting on their own, without bulldozers or large crews, trying to protect cattle and entire livelihoods with whatever equipment they have on hand, getting far less national attention than a fire tearing through a major city, even though the personal stakes for those families are every bit as high. These are people fighting, often alone, on land that's been in their families for generations, with far less outside support than a metropolitan area the size of Spokane can call on. Now, let's talk about who is accused of starting this, because the arson element of this disaster is both a criminal case and, in its own way, a case study in how dangerous a single spark can become under the wrong conditions. Investigators arrested a 37-year-old Spokane man named Aaron Farinacci on a charge of first-degree arson in connection with the Old Trails fire. He appeared in court by video link, with bond set at $1 million. His record includes a prior manslaughter conviction out of Arizona from 2010. According to later reporting, Farinacci told investigators he had planned this fire in advance, going as far as researching a past serial arsonist and monitoring weather conditions before choosing his moment. He has also told police he was responsible for setting roughly 24 additional fires in the area going back to the summer of 2025. A detail that, if it holds up, would suggest this wasn't an isolated act of recklessness, but part of a much longer pattern. The causes of the Autumn Lane and Fairview fires remain under separate investigation and have not been formally connected to Farinacci at this point. It's worth understanding what arson means, specifically under the conditions that existed that Saturday, because it changes how you should think about the moral weight of what's being alleged. In ordinary fire weather, adequate fuel moisture, calm winds, a match dropped into a grassy area might start a small fire that self-extinguishes, or burns a few acres before crews arrive and put it out with minimal drama. In the conditions that existed in northwest Spokane at midday on August 1st, with fuel moisture in the critical range and winds gusting past 40 miles an hour, a single spark in the right spot was, from a fire behavior standpoint, closer to touching a match to spilled gasoline. That doesn't change the legal or moral responsibility involved in deliberately setting that spark. If anything, it sharpens it, because it means either a deliberate intention to cause catastrophic destruction or an extraordinary disregard for what the consequences were almost certain to be. Determining exactly which of those applies and what charges and sentencing follow from it will play out through the courts in the months ahead. But from a fire management standpoint, this disaster illustrates something fire scientists have been saying with increasing urgency for years. In extreme fire weather, there is no practical way to guarantee ignition control. You cannot police every spark. The only real mitigation available is reducing the fuel load on the ground, cutting down potential ignition sources where you can, and, since nobody can control the weather, investing in defensible space around homes, hardened building materials, and early detection systems that give communities the best possible chance of catching a fire before it turns into something like this. So where does this stand right now, as of the most recent updates coming out of Spokane County? The picture has actually improved somewhat since those brutal opening days, even if it's still far from resolved. Fire officials reported this past week that the Autumn Lane fire had reached 37% containment, the Old Trails fire 23%, and the Fairview fire 31%. Combined, the three fires have now burned past 10,000 acres. The estimated number of structures damaged or destroyed has climbed to roughly 921, a significant jump from the 600 plus confirmed in those first chaotic days, reflecting just how much additional assessment work crews have completed as they've moved block by block through the burn zones. Nearly 2,000 fire personnel from more than 170 different jurisdictions are now involved in the response, supported by what incident commanders have described, only half-jokingly, as a mobile city, a base camp with its own medical services, food service, laundry, and shower facilities built to support the sheer number of people working the fire lines. But officials have also been careful not to declare victory. Fire lines in several areas remain thin, and commanders have warned that high winds forecast for the days ahead could push flames back over containment lines and into areas that had previously been cleared for return. In fact, as of this past Friday and Saturday, critical fire weather conditions were once again expected across Spokane and eastern Washington. A fresh reminder that even a week of hard-won progress can be undone quickly if wind and humidity swing back the wrong way. Spokane County's sheriff has said directly that as soon as it's safe to let residents back into their homes, officials will do it. But that safety, not a calendar, is what's driving the timeline. Mayor Brown, speaking earlier this week, put it plainly. The city has known for years about the dangers of a changing climate and has been working to reduce the risk, but this, in her words, remains an unprecedented situation, and it isn't over yet. That phrase, unprecedented, is doing real work in that sentence. It doesn't mean Spokane has never had a bad fire year. The 2023 fires alone should put that idea to rest. It means a wildfire burning directly through urban residential neighborhoods at this scale, this fast, hasn't happened in the city's modern history. And the reason it happened now has a name in fire science, the Wildland-Urban Interface, or WUI, the zone where developed, populated land meets or blends into wildland vegetation. Sometimes that interface looks dramatic, like a mountain cabin surrounded by dense pine forest. Spokane's version is subtler, residential neighborhoods built in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s on land that used to be open rangeland, sitting right at the edge of patches of native bunchgrass and shrub that create a continuous, unbroken path of fuel straight into the heart of established subdivisions. In an average fire year, that kind of suburban WI might not pose much of a threat, because fuel moisture is usually high enough that fires get suppressed before they can bridge from wild land into residential streets. In a year like this one, with critical fuel moisture and sustained 40-mile-an-hour winds, that bridge from wildland to structure became almost instantaneous. This matters well beyond Spokane, because the conventional mental picture most people carry of wildfire in America is a rural one. Flames in the mountains, in forests, threatening cabins and small towns, affecting people who chose an elevated risk as the price of living somewhere forested. The fire in that picture doesn't come into the city because a city is by definition not wildland. That mental model has been quietly failing for years across the American West, and Spokane has now broken it in a way that's very hard to argue with. A city of 230,000 people, the second largest in the state of Washington, lost hundreds of homes and forced 65,000 residents into evacuation in a single day. The fire didn't burn up to the edge of the city and stop there. It burned into it, and the neighborhoods it burned through were built during decades when this kind of fire weather was considered a rare event rather than something approaching a predictable seasonal extreme. Built with wood framing, asphalt shingles, wooden decks, and landscaping that, without anyone intending it, created continuous fuel paths running straight from open wildland to the walls of people's houses. Zoom out even further, and this fits into a wider western wildfire season that has been stretching resources thin across the whole region. Washington state alone has seen more than 1,000 fires burn roughly 425,000 acres so far this year, with something like 200,000 acres actively burning at one point across a dozen large fires statewide. California, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, and Colorado have all been managing significant fire complexes of their own at the same time. One of the country's most experienced large fire management teams was deployed specifically to Spokane, which tells you something about the priority federal officials assigned to this particular incident. But it also means that team wasn't available for other fires elsewhere that might have needed it just as badly. Multiple outlets have reported plainly that this stretch of simultaneous fire activity is testing the limits of federal, state, and local firefighting capacity all at once. The mutual aid system that brings incident management teams, hotshot crews, air tankers, and helicopters from across the country to support state agencies is functioning exactly as it's designed to. But functioning as designed in a resource-constrained environment means constant prioritization, which means some fires inevitably get fewer resources than they would in a quieter season. Spokane, given its population and economic weight, has been getting priority, but it's getting that priority inside a national system that is at or very near full capacity. So what happens from here? The honest answer is that nobody can promise a clean end date. Containment has climbed from 0 to somewhere between roughly a quarter and a third across the three fires, which is real, meaningful progress, but it's not full containment, and the forecast for renewed critical fire weather this weekend is a reminder that this event can still get worse before it fully resolves. The work that actually determines how the next event like this plays out, because officials are already treating this as a near certainty that will happen again somewhere in the region, isn't glamorous, and it doesn't happen during the crisis itself. It's defensible space programs around individual homes. It's building codes and structure hardening requirements in wildland urban interface zones. It's ongoing vegetation management to break up continuous fuel paths before they ever reach a subdivision. It's investment in early detection and public warning systems that can shave crucial minutes off the gap between a first spark and a level 3 evacuation order. That work happens on budget cycles, not news cycles. It produces far fewer dramatic images than burning neighborhoods do. But it is, according to almost everyone who studies this professionally, the actual determining factor in whether the next extreme fire weather event in a place like Spokane produces 200 destroyed structures, or 715,000 evacuees, or 65,000. For now, thousands of families are living out of hotels, staying with relatives, or waiting in shelters while officials work through what's safe to reopen and what still needs to be checked, house by house, for hazards left behind by the fire. The recovery for a lot of these households is going to stretch on for months, in many cases years, long after the last flame is out and the story has moved off the news cycle entirely. The city of Spokane has set up an official donation portal for people who want to help directly, and local organizations coordinating shelter, food, and supplies for evacuees have said they're seeing real strain given how quickly this crisis developed and how many people it's touched at once, meaning even relatively small contributions of money, supplies, or time are making a genuine difference on the ground right now. If there's one thing worth carrying away from everything that's happened in Spokane over the past week, it's this. The line people used to draw between a city and a wildfire zone doesn't hold the way it used to. The weather conditions that produced this event, extended drought, record heat, critical humidity, high wind, are not freak, one-off circumstances confined to a single unlucky Saturday. They're becoming a more regular feature of summers across the interior West, and the neighborhoods sitting at the edge of that risk were, in most cases, built decades before anyone was planning for conditions like these. Spokane will rebuild. Containment lines will eventually close around all three of these fires. But the underlying question the city is being forced to answer right now, what to do differently before the next event like this one arrives, is one that officials, residents, and communities across the wider American West are all going to be working through together for a long time to come. Stay safe if you're anywhere near this fire zone. Keep an eye on official evacuation updates rather than secondhand information circulating online. And please don't return to any restricted area until officials have explicitly confirmed that it's safe to do so.